What's up guys, my name is Ace, and welcome back to the Versus series. This is the series where I take similar elements from Call of Duty, I put them side by side, have a deep look at their stats to find out which one is best. And in today's episode, we're going to be changing things up a little bit. I'm actually going to be comparing 3 guns together within the context of Warzone, and these are the M4A1, the Ram 7, and the M13. Now, the main reason I wanted to do these 3 together is the Ram 7 and the M4 are incredibly similar, so of course I'm going to compare those two, and the M13 doesn't really have another counterpart to compare it to. These would be the closest things. And this is why I wanted to make this 3-way comparison all about the faster fire rate full auto assault rifles. So let's just jump right into the basics. Let's start it off with rate of fire. With the M4, our rate of fire is 833 rounds per minute. The Ram 7 is 882 rounds per minute, so noticeably better. And then even better than that is the M13 at 923 rounds per minute. Basically, the way I look at it, the faster the fire rate, the more forgiving a gun is if you happen to be missing a shot or two. So missing a bullet or two with the M13 isn't going to be nearly as punishing as missing a couple bullets with the M4. Now, as for our damage, we're going to look at this in a bit more detail in a little bit, but with the M4 and the Ram 7, our damage is 28 up close and 18 at longer ranges, whereas with the M13, it's 24 up close, but 19 at long ranges. Now, this brings us into our damage per second, which is a really important stat when we start factoring armor into the equation especially. Keep in mind this is within the maximum damage range. Our DPS value with the M4 is 389, the Ram 7 is the best of these 3 at 412, and the M13 is the worst of the 3 at 369. What this means is for our minimum theoretical time to kill up close, assuming the enemy has no armor, you can see that the Ram 7 is going to kill the fastest, the M16 is a little bit slower, and then the M13 is actually noticeably slower. However, there's a little bit of nuance to this. The way the damage profile is set up, with just one single headshot mixed in, the M13 can actually easily overtake the time to kill of the Ram 7 and the M4, whereas with those guns, you're going to need multiple headshots in order to reduce the number of shots to kill. But this also takes us to our minimum time to kill, assuming the enemy has 3 armor plates up close. We once again see a similar story. The Ram 7 is the fastest at 544 milliseconds, then we have the M4 being a little bit slower, and then finally the slowest is going to be the M13. So overall, while the M13 does appear to be more forgiving with shots, it also doesn't quite have the same raw killing potential as the M4 or Ram 7. However, I did want to take a bit of a deeper look into the damage profiles here since they are different in this case, and I want to see how they interact with different armor plates and how many shots it will take to kill to the body. Basically, what I'm trying to show here is up close, yes, the M13 is at a disadvantage compared to the other assault rifles, assuming perfect accuracy in all cases. However, when we start getting to the longer ranges, that one extra damage point that the M13 has over the other guns, this can actually make a difference in the number of shots to kill when the enemy has some armor equipped. And this means, well, generally speaking, the Ram 7 and M4 will kill faster. The M13 actually kills faster at range because it's going to kill in either the same number of shots to kill or one fewer shot to kill, and it has a noticeably faster fire rate as well. Now, speaking of these ranges, let's have a look at the range comparison here, and as you can see, the M13 doesn't get that 4-shot kill range, unlike the Ram 7 and M4, so up close there, the M4 and Ram 7 have a clear advantage, and they're fairly similar in this area. The M4 does have a slight edge in the 4-shot kill range department. Then when it comes to the 5-shot kill range, the Ram 7 actually has a better 5-shot kill range than the M4, and the M4's 5-shot kill range is better than the M13's 5-shot kill range. And then after that is where I wanted to point out, all of these drop off to a 6-shot kill against an enemy with no armor, and this is where you start to see that time to kill advantage going to the M13. But next, I did want to show what these ranges look like with the longest barrels equipped for all of these guns, just to see what the potential is as far as your ranges. And you can see here, the Ram 7 with the Ranger barrel actually has the best potential as far as that 5-shot kill range. However, the M4 with the Grenadier barrel does have a slightly better 4-shot kill range. Now, range values don't mean much if you can't hit your target at range, so let's have a look at the base recoil comparison with these 3 guns. Keep in mind this is with no attachments equipped. And as you can see here, with the M4 and the Ram 7, they're basically just mirrored recoil patterns. The M4 kicks upwards and then to the right, whereas the Ram 7 kicks upwards and then to the left. And they both seem to have the exact same magnitude to their recoil as well. Personally, I absolutely hate recoil patterns that go to the left, and I have a very hard time controlling those compared to recoil patterns that go to the right, which is what we're used to in Call of Duty. But that is personal preference to an extent, and I do realize some people have no problem with left-leaning recoil. As for the M13 though, you can see that this is kind of like a shrunken version of the recoil pattern from the M4. It has noticeably less recoil than both of the other guns, and it does kick upwards and then to the right. Out of these three guns, I definitely feel most confident at longer ranges with the M13, which is a little bit strange since it's the higher fire rate assault rifle. You would think that it would have more recoil, not less. Now, as for what happens to our recoil when we stack these out with some really good attachments that are going to help with our recoil, and these are basically realistic builds that I would use within Warzone, this is what we end up getting. We can actually significantly shrink down the recoil patterns for both the M4 and the Ram 7, so they start becoming a lot more similar to the M13, but they still don't quite catch up with the M13, assuming you're using the right attachment setup. In either case, let's move on to a few other stats. The first one here is going to be aim down sight time, which is quite important, being able to get on target as fast as possible. And you can see the M4 and the M13 are exactly the same at 250 milliseconds, whereas the Ram 7 is actually a little bit faster. Then when it comes to movement speed, they're pretty much the same in this area. The M13 is 1% slower than the others, which is worth being aware of, but it's not really all that noticeable. And then we have our reload time, which with the M4 and the M13, they're both pretty similar at about 1.3 to 1.4 seconds, whereas the Ram 7 is noticeably slower than both of these at 1.62 seconds. In Warzone, this isn't usually the biggest deal just because you're usually going to be using the biggest magazine possible, and therefore you don't need to be reloading all the time and dealing with tons and tons of enemies all the time, but it is still something to be aware of. Moving on to the next thing I want to look at. So far we've been looking at pretty much just base stats. Now I want to look at the effect that these longest barrels have on these guns. With both the Grenadier barrel on the M4 and the Ranger barrel on the Ram 7, we get a 40% boost to our damage ranges, whereas the Marksman is just a 33% boost, which is still a really nice boost, but it's not as good as 40%, obviously. Then when it comes to aim down sight time, we aim down sight just a little bit faster with the Grenadier barrel compared to the longest barrels on the other guns. And then finally, when it comes to movement speed, we see a 4% decrease on the Grenadier and the Ranger, whereas the Marksman only has a 3% decrease, and this actually equalizes our movement speed at this point because, if you guys remember, the base M13 moves 1% slower than the other two. Now, one last thing I wanted to look at when comparing these guns is the iron sights, because this can be important when it comes to attachment selection. With some guns, the iron sights are just fine, whereas with others, you can really feel like you're at a disadvantage if you don't have an optic equipped. And as you can see here, the M4 with the Grenadier, as well as the Ram 7 with the Ranger barrel, I actually don't mind those iron sights at all. I think they're perfectly fine, and therefore I don't really feel a need to use an optic with these. With the M13, on the other hand, the iron sights are fine for close to mid ranges, but if I'm trying to stretch things out and be really precise with the M13, I really do feel like an optic makes a big difference for me, and therefore I will often use an optic on that. On the flip side of that though, something I like to do with the M13 is I don't use the longest barrel. I actually use the barrel with the integrated suppressor, the Cyclone Barrel. The reason for this is you still get a bit of a range boost with that. It's about a 15% boost to your range, even though it's not stated, and then you don't have to run a suppressor as well. So you get all of that included in one attachment, which is really nice. So I really feel like that kind of makes up for the fact that I will typically lean towards using an optic on this gun compared to the others. And that pretty much wraps it up for the overall stat comparison, but now I wanted to look at my current favorite setup for Warzone for each of these guns. And the M4 one, you've already seen this, so I'll just kind of skim through it. We've got the monolithic suppressor, the Grenadier barrel, the tac laser, which is great for faster aiming down sight, as well as aiming stability, which is incredibly useful at longer ranges in Warzone. Then we've got a 60 round magazine on this, which is great, and then finally the Commando foregrip, which is also really helpful. As for my Ram 7 class, it's basically the exact same thing. I'm using the monolithic suppressor, the longest possible barrel, which is the Ranger, the tac laser, the 50 round magazine, just because that's the biggest magazine you can get with the Ram 7, which by the way is another slight downside to using the Ram 7 over the other two, and then finally the Commando foregrip. And this just leaves us with my M13 class, which a lot of people have been asking about. This is what I've kind of settled into as my favorite M13 class setup in Warzone. With this, we've got the Tempest Cyclone Barrel, which has that integrated suppressor. We've got the Solo Zero Mini Reflex, which I just really like the looks of that, and it's nice to have a mini reflex on this gun. The Skeleton Stock, I've done a bunch of testing on aim down sight times, and this just seems to have the most benefits possible for this gun. Then after that, we've got the 60 round mag and the Merc foregrip, not the Commando foregrip on this one. I definitely prefer Merc foregrip on the M13. Now, you may have noticed through all of that, I did show the aim down sight time values, and the Ram 7 build has the fastest aim down sight time, with the M13 coming in just 1 frame slower, and then the M4 actually has the slowest aim down sight time of these three, with all of those attachments stacked. So that is something else to consider when looking at this comparison. But this finally brings us into the conclusion of this video. Out of these 3 assault rifles, which one is best, in my opinion, after looking at all these stats and after just having experience with all of them? The first thing I'm going to say is all 3 of these guns are great in Warzone. There is nothing wrong with using any of them, and I highly encourage you to try all of them out, because a lot of this ends up coming down to preference. When it comes to close to mid-range, the Ram 7 for me is the best, just because it's got the best time to kill, it's got the best overall DPS value, it's got an excellent time to kill, and great handling as well. If we're just ranking these, my next best up close, I would actually pick the M13 over the M4, even though it technically has a slower time to kill. I just like that the M13 is much more forgiving. If I happen to miss a couple shots, it's not a big deal. Plus, if I'm mixing headshots in there, I can really equalize a lot of the downsides in the time to kill department of the M13. And with my particular setup, we've got better handling as well compared to the M4. So that's just talking about up close though. When we start stretching the ranges out, this is where I start to prefer either the M4 or the M13. The Ram 7 is eliminated from the equation for me at this point because, for me personally, I just don't like that recoil. I have a very hard time controlling the Ram 7 recoil beyond about, let's just say, 25 meters or so. Beyond there, I feel like I am much better off with an M13 or an M4. And this just brings us to the overall big picture. Which one of these guns do I feel is best? Now, unfortunately, out of the 3, I actually like the Ram 7 the least, which might seem kind of strange because it does have a lot of upsides and it is technically the most powerful gun up close. But generally, if I'm using an assault rifle, I'm looking for a really well-balanced build that is good at all ranges, rather than really good at just some ranges and not very good at others in my hands. So that narrows it down to the M4 versus the M13. And while this is a really close fight and I am perfectly comfortable with either of these, I've actually been leaning a lot more in the direction of the M13 lately. I just like the fact that the M13, first off, has better handling with the setup that I use, its recoil is a little bit easier to control, and finally, it's just more forgiving. If I happen to be missing shots, which realistically speaking, there will be missed shots involved. And this is why I've really been enjoying the M13, and I actually would take that over the M4 at this point. Of course, though, that's just my opinion based on my experience with this, as well as a look at the raw statistics of these weapons. I'd like to know in the comments section below, out of these 3 assault rifles, which one do you think is best overall for Warzone? Which one are you most comfortable with? Just let me know those thoughts and why in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.